We have 4 identities. We have 5 major authorities, and we have 11 missions. 10 of which we do here in South Texas because we don't break any ice here. At all times, the Coast Guard is an armed force. We're also a regulatory agency, and we're a law enforcement agency, and we remain a member of the intel community. So we wear all of those hats at all times.
Ready to roll?
Yep.
All right.
Real Texan.
Why should this matter to Real Texans? Hey, welcome to this edition of Real Texans, talking to men and women who are trying to make the Lone Star State better. I am today in Port Aransas at the Port Aransas Coast Guard Station with Captain Torrey Bertheau, who is the sector commander for the Corpus Christi Sector of the Coast Guard. Captain Bertheau, thanks for sitting down.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so in interest of full disclosure, you know this, these folks don't know this. You're my brother. Okay, you and I have known each other for a long time, which is great because we both have a nice sense of mutually assured destruction if we get too far off of a conversation. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about your path in the Coast Guard. I want to talk a little bit about the Coast Guard itself. As the sector commander for the Corpus Christi Sector, you're kind of the region you and your team deal with go about, 200 miles off the coast?
Yes.
From essentially halfway to Galveston down to the border, about a third of the Texas land mass, which we'll talk about, all of New Mexico. That's a big area.
Absolutely.
Tell me about the kinds of missions that the, 800,000 men and women under your command perform in this area.
Okay. Well, I always start when I'm describing the Coast Guard, just because I could probably sit here and take up the whole interview describing some of the things that we do. But it's important to understand kind of what the Coast Guard is and what it isn't. We are, I have a catchphrase. We have 4 identities. We have 5 major authorities, and we have 11 missions. 10 of which we do here in South Texas because we don't break any ice here. Last week we almost had to break some
You almost
ice,
were,
but, yeah. So at all times, the Coast Guard is an armed force. We're also a regulatory agency, and we're a law enforcement agency, and we remain a member of the intel community. So we wear all of those hats at all times. So with those 11 missions, I won't go through all of those, but we have the Coast Guard model in operations is kind of a prevention and response. So we have some preventative measures, folks that are going out and doing operations to kind of stop the bad things from happening in the maritime environment. And then the responders that, like these response boats out here, when something does go wrong, go out and respond to the incident. So on the prevention side, we have, actually going back to the 5 authorities. So technically obviously my team does all of the heavy work, but the sector has the 5 major authorities, which is officer in charge of marine inspection, search and rescue mission coordinator, the federal maritime security coordinator, federal on-scene coordinator, and then the last one is the captain of the port. So that is a designation that controls waterways, controls all the elements of the marine transportation system that come together. We have operational control against threats or hazards. So officer in charge of marine inspection, we have teams of folks that go out and do commercial vessel inspection, right? And those are foreign vessels. Sometimes they're domestic vessels. It could be the largest tanker that we have going through the waterway, or it can also be like an excursion vessel that we see right over here, that are taking out passengers for hire, and everything in between, barges, tugs, all of that. We have a team of investigators that go out when the marine casualties happen, collisions, groundings, that go out and investigate that and then look for causal factors. And then also, sometimes there's some enforcement that takes place as a result of that. We have a whole division of folks that are waterways managers. So you have events that happen on the water that sometimes get permitted, that kind of thing. We also send out a lot of safety zones and security zones, and interaction with all of the stakeholders in the waterway, and so we call them the waterways management folks. So that's kind of the prevention folks in the safety. So like that's under the safety. We're talking about safety, security, and stewardship. Also under safety, we have aids to navigation. So ATON. You can see some buoys. You're talking buoys, ranges, and beacons. Those get serviced by a special unit in the Coast Guard that to maintain federal channels.
Right.
So then on the response side, it's more traditional, where you have search and rescue, law enforcement, port security, and environmental protection. So when pollution does take place, we have groups of folks that go out and investigate that. We have tools to initiate a cleanup, and then also oversee responsible parties and those kinds of things. On the search and rescue side, we have response boats, we have cutters, and we also have aircraft. So two types of aircraft in the area. Helicopters. I know there's some interest in our orange helicopters, and we have some fixed wing also that fly. Actually, their range goes the entirety of the Gulf of America. So the CASA. On the law enforcement side, there is a lot in the law enforcement. So it could be as simple as doing a recreational boating safety, making sure that a rec boat has, the right amount of life jackets or carrying all the appropriate safety equipment. Or we also have a border mission that's down. You mentioned the southern border, so we have a maritime boundary line where Mexican vessels attempt to come into our territory and take our living marine resources, and so we have special folks trained to go after that.
Right.
We do domestic fisheries too, so shrimping and other some of the other missions, or some of the other types of fisheries that are federally regulated, we regulate that stuff. So, and then we also have we have an intel division, like I was telling you about. So we have intel, and I can tell you about that, but I'd have to kill you.
Well, let's not do that today.
But kind of both with our armed force hat on, the intel community, we have access to that. But then also on the law enforcement side, and all of our key stakeholders, law enforcement partners that we work with, we work on both sides of that coin. And then we have an emergency management department that is it's just that. It's a contingency planning, where we plan for those bad things that are happening. They exercise and evaluate, and then train to get better holistically as a port, actually, not just the Coast Guard. And we don't do any of that stuff on our own. We are a small but mighty service, but we rely on partnerships with our other government agencies, and then also the industry as well.
So I want to talk more about the Coast Guard in a second. I want to talk about you for a moment.
Okay.
A lot of these conversations, I want to kind of give folks an idea of kind of where people come from and how they can maybe engage with that in some ways. You grew up in Lake Jackson. As I recall, you as a teenager, you split your time between playing soccer and being on the beach, right? So there's always been an attraction for you to the ocean, to the waterways, that kind of thing. But I'm curious, what drew you? I've never asked you this. You at various points, like all teenagers, you talked about the military, you talked about law enforcement, you talked about going into business, all these different kind of things you talked about over the years. And so I'm curious, what was it that drew you to the Coast Guard? Because fairly early on, you started talking about the Coast Guard.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a good question. I think it goes back to my folks. My dad kind of introduced us to the Coast Guard. He worked closely with the local Coast Guard in Freeport, Texas.
Right.
There was a station just like very, very much like this station that we're at in Freeport, and a cutter there. So I think it was woven into the fabric of the community. Everybody kind of knew about the Coast Guard and the value that they brought. And then we got to go visit. I mean, I remember being on the mess deck and taking a tour and stuff when I was probably middle school.
Right.
My mom says I always wanted to be, an Army guy. So I think you're right about that fact. And then I went off to school, came out. I worked, I worked in corporate America for a little while and for a couple of years, and that didn't really fit. So that was pre 9/11. And when I was done, I thought, as you point out, sort of had sea fever. I knew I wanted to go to sea. So I was like, should I go to the Navy or do I go to the Coast Guard, which I know? And at that time, we were not at war, and 9/11 had not happened. So I really thought, hey, the Coast Guard is out there doing search and rescue and doing these missions, some of which I didn't know about, but the ones I knew about, doing value every single day. And that's why I signed up.
You did your undergrad in Louisiana. You did some other things for a while, business kind of related stuff. But you then did OCS at the Coast Guard Academy in Connecticut. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I spent 18 weeks, it's shorter now, 18 weeks in Connecticut from October to February. And it was not a pleasant experience in terms of weather. I would say it was probably one of the most challenging things I've ever done. I think most people, I don't know if I would have survived 4 years in another environment, because I only did 4 months of it, and you are always on. You're being challenged at every level. So I tell people I don't know if I would do it again, but I am proud that I got through it. And it was, other than being cold, we got a lot of great opportunities. We got to sail on some ships and come to operational units and figure out what was actually, what the Coast Guard is actually about. But a lot of it, and learn my military bearing, because I had none. I was just a college kid, a frat rat that came off the street. So the cool thing about Officer Candidate School too is that a lot of my shipmates in the class were prior enlisted, right? So they've been enlisted and they showed us the way. So when we would make silly mistakes, they would kind of like get us back on path. So I was really thankful that I had mentors that kind of knew about the military and guided us through that. I don't know if I would have made it through the experience without them.
Your career in the Coast Guard now has spanned, you've done on the law enforcement side, you were the navigator on a cutter, you've done some of the emergency management stuff. I think that the thing you did in the Coast Guard that I remember you letting us know, oh, you're about to go do this thing. I thought, I didn't know the Coast Guard did overseas deployments, but you did. And in fact, because of you, I learned the Coast Guard has folks on a lot of our naval vessels. Explain that for folks.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, my first assignment was aboard a ship, and I really enjoyed that. But it sort of dipped my toe into the federal law enforcement, because it was just a collateral duty. Hey, you drive the ship, but then you also jump on the boat and go do the boardings. And then I was lucky enough and blessed enough to go to law enforcement detachment. It's called TACLET. You've probably seen actually some of those specialized units have been in the news very recently.
News lately,
actually,
yeah,
you may have seen that. We did some vertical insertion and some fast roping and those kinds of things. But I tell people it's not really like special forces. It's more like SWAT, where you're a specialized unit and you have better weapons and tactics than the average boarding officer. And the unique thing is, I think we figured out in the way back when, was that we would send this small detachment of law enforcement officers with that authority out on a naval vessels, and then you could use that authority to enforce U.S. law. Right. So I mean, our core back in those days, the core was to go on U.S. naval vessels, but also Allied ships as well in the Caribbean. So you had Dutch vessels and you have British vessels, some French vessels that were in the counter-drug alien migrant interdiction operation game. And so we would ride those. We were ship riders, and we did our specialized job. And then I think if I'm picking up what you're putting down, I think also that was around 04, 05. So we were also deployed to Operation Iraqi Freedom for 4 or 5 months actually to Kuwait, and then we were also on the ground in Iraq for a while, training Marines, doing not necessarily fighting the war, but we were patrolling the oil platforms that were there, and then also helping our allied partners learn how to be a Coast Guard.
The Coast Guard is an interesting service that its history traces back to the 1790s, and it feels like in a lot of ways the modern Coast Guard is kind of one of these entities that You need someone to watch the coast. Oh, let these guys do it. You need someone to, there's kind of always we need someone too, and that becomes a mission of the Coast Guard in a lot of ways. And so that means that you do have, within a very small force, you do have a lot of folks with some very kind of unique knowledge, unique skill sets that do make for good training opportunities then for when people get into special circumstances.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of goes back. We talked about the four identities, and there's really, when you talk about the modern Coast Guard, how we had all of those different missions, really, it kind of came together, post like 1915-ish is the modern Coast Guard is when is what we recognize, what you'd recognize it as today. But really, it's kind of an amalgamation of four separate entities, which, back to 1790, our history was in the Revenue Cutter Service. So that's armed cutters, at ports to ensure that customs is being, customs and federal law is being followed. And then there was three other entities. You have your lighthouse service, which didn't exist. So that's sort of the impetus behind aids to navigation, right? Making sure that ships sail safely. And then the life saving service. So that's very close to this. We're sitting on a multi-mission station where, in the 18th century, they were rowing out. They would row out and save mariners in distress and vessels that had capsized. So, and then the last was the steamboat inspection service. So in the 1850s, as the ships became more and more complex, the dangers went up, and you had this demand signal for them to be inspected and safe for people to be aboard. Right. So all four of those kind of came together, and then, as you point out, I think with those broad authorities, sometimes a few extras get thrown in there too. So sometimes my challenge is trying to remember them all. Actually, that's why we have such a great team. Actually, that reminds me.
It takes a team to take care of all those things.
It really does.
All right, so I think for your name is you're called the Coast Guard. Coast, that implies certain things. I think when most of us think of the Coast Guard, we're thinking of the white and orange vessels out in the Gulf of America. We think maybe of helicopters throwing down a life basket, things like that. I think a lot of us, particularly those of us who live in Central Texas, got a little different view of the Coast Guard about a year ago when the Coast Guard was participating in some of the rescue efforts in pretty far from the coast. Y'all were involved in that kind of operation as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's a great example. I appreciate you bringing that up. I mean, what I would say to that is, and you brought up the landmass too, it's really tied to the waterway in a way that our area is kind of sliced the entire United States up into small pieces, but it kind of cuts both ways. So we rely on support from other government agencies, and then we also respond immediately when there's requests for assistance. So the Air Station Corpus Christi was one of the first. They are trained in maritime search and rescue, but also just search and rescue in general. So as soon as we got the call, it came through our command center, here in Corpus Christi, and we, the decision was send what we have. Sometimes we rearranged coverage elsewhere so that they could go and provide that support and save so many lives. So I know you've seen those stories. So that's a common occurrence when an agency, whether it's Texas or federal or local, any of those agencies ask for help, we go right away. And they were trained to do the mission, and it had a great outcome. So,
tell me a little bit about the kind of career opportunities for folks who, whether coming out of college, maybe looking at other opportunities in their life. You took a little break from the Coast Guard for a brief period and were in the Border Patrol.
That's right. Came
back to the Coast Guard. What kind of opportunities are there for folks who might be kind of intrigued by the Coast Guard?
The sky is the limit. I don't want to go talk about the future too much. The the state of affairs right now is there's a tons of opportunity. Make no mistake, we are part of the joint force, so it is the military. So those that want to put on the uniform, you have to remember It is very much the military, but we have, if you want to be a boat driver, if you want to be on the, and this is, so you have an officer and enlisted, just like every other service. So now on the enlisted side, where you're actually, you're tactically, carrying out the mission all the time throughout your whole career. You're the expert boat driver. You have, machinery technicians that are, as Master Chief told us earlier, he fixes his own boats, right? Because he has a workforce that does that and supports it. We have maritime enforcement specialists, so folks that are only boarding officers. That's all they do. We have command centers. I mentioned earlier, I didn't really talk about how our command center is the glue that keeps all of it together. It's the beating heart of all of those missions, 24/7. So it's kind of like a dispatch. It's like a dispatch on steroids. They do a lot more than just press the button or send the resource. They're also planners, right? Search and rescue planners. So they know how to look for something that's lost in the marine environment. Those are operations specialists, and they're also aboard cutters, the larger cutters. So you can have a ship to shore kind of career path. Cyber is another big. We're adapting. Everything is becoming more and more related to technology. So we have a huge cyber force, and that is a demand signal for not only the intel specialists, but also IT, information technology folks, and then cyber specialists that are learning how to actually provide, find the bad guys in the cyber domain, just along with the joint force. We've got cyber like that. And then we have an entire mission support mechanism that supports all of those operations as well. Where, you've got storekeepers, you've got yeomen, which, kind of like more administrative type things. You have gunner's mates, right? We have, I didn't mention to you, but, to be that law enforcement agency, you also have to have large armories. And you have folks that are dedicated to ensuring qualification and proficiency, and then also, maintaining all of the weapon systems that the Coast Guard has, a lot like, the other services. So, but we're growing too. I sort of mentioned recently with the new, our new administration, there has been, the one big beautiful bill has also provided historic funding for the Coast Guard. So we're going to grow. Lots of different assets are going to come online, brand new ones. So all of our traditional ratings are going to be there too, but then also a robotic, like we're talking about robotic specialists, where you have unmanned aerial systems, unmanned underwater systems, and then all on the surface. Those technologies are coming, and we're building a workforce to be able to support that. So those are things in the future.
One interesting kind of side, I don't know if it's a mission or just an activity you guys have to do. Y'all also play a role when SpaceX does launches, which again kind of surprised me to learn. Probably shouldn't have with your marine safety operations, but surprised when you just kind of casually mentioned that there was a launch coming up and you had something to do with it. That surprised me.
Yeah. I mean, it's exciting actually. So down in Boca Chica, so down in the Brownsville area, right along the U.S.-Mexican border, is where Starship Super Heavy launches from, and so we, as a stakeholder group, we are the federal regulators and have to make the decision on what the danger to the maritime public is, and, especially when the rockets started coming back, because sometimes they make it, sometimes they accomplish their mission and come back safely, and then sometimes it goes into the water, and then that becomes a hazard. So really, it's no different. It's safety, security, environmental protection, but just adapting to what the situation is. And you've got rockets coming up and down in that area. We got to keep the commercial and the recreational waterways safe. So we provide safety zones. We're not always involved in enforcing them because they're a private entity. It is not NASA. NASA's not a part of it there, but we do maintain the limited access areas to keep people safe.
Last thing for you, day in and day out, how can Texans support the work of the Coast Guard? What do y'all hope people day in and day out know about the Coast Guard?
Well, just that we're here to support, and we're a part of all those other entities. We are We're a small and mighty service, and a part of every community. Not always out in the forefront, but definitely a big part of the unity of effort to keep ports and waterways and the coast safe. So, if you dial the easiest example, and I brought up the command center, is if you dial 911 and there's it's a maritime nexus, chances are you're going to be speaking to a coastie on the phone, who's then going to make sure you get the right resource out there to be helped. If you're a boater, or if you'll probably come in contact with our folks out in marinas, but then we also have this other entity called the Coast Guard Auxiliary. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's they're volunteers. They are a part of the Coast Guard, and that's another opportunity where you could support is, recreational boating safety is one of their primary missions, to spread the word. They will do an inspection of your vessel for free, to make sure that you have the required equipment, so that you don't find out the hard way when the law enforcement is out there. And they have boating safety courses. So that's one way that you can get involved. Another cool thing about Corpus Christi, if I can do a little plug here, is Corpus Christi recently became the newest Coast Guard city in the whole nation. The first in Texas, actually, the only Coast Guard city in Texas. And that was, we feel the love here. That was actually something that the city did on their own. It wasn't anything that we could give to them. It was that they put in a package demonstrating how much they support us here, and have all support all of our members and our dependents and our operations here. So that's really cool. That's a way they can can support the Coast Guard in the future. We also have at one of the local high schools here has one of the first junior ROTC programs that's Coast Guard only, and that's I think that's the first. Well, it's the 12th in the nation, but it's the first in Texas. So that's another way that folks locally will see them out and about doing all things that ROTC does, but with a Coast Guard focus and a maritime focus. So.
Outstanding. Well, Captain Torrey Bertheau, Sector Commander of the Corpus Christi Sector, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Michael. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining this edition of Real Texans.